Hello everyone, it's Silver. This is Skelethrone, the Chronicles of Ericona. So it's a Metroidvania, basically, but it's using some Soulslike elements, as they often do. And it's got a pretty standard formula here. You won't find anything that's like extremely out of the ordinary, but you will find some really nice art and stuff. The art style of this game is, I would call it crude, but I mean that in a good way. It reminds me of like early to mid 2000s edgy Newgrounds artist kind of style. I think it actually looks pretty good, and maybe it's just because I have some nostalgia for that style, but also I think that the environment art, especially in this game, does sort of elevate it a little bit, and it looks quite nice. So when I say crude, I mean in a similar sense to something like Salt and Sanctuary was. The music is also really nice. It does fit the sort of environmental art style. It's not super action-y music, but I don't think it's trying to be. It's a lot more kind of wandering music, a little bit more calm, a little bit dark, but not overly so. It's a good soundtrack, I think, and it tends to match the area you're in quite well. Mechanically, it's got kind of the standard list of features that you would expect from a game of this type. So you've got a basic selection of equipment slots, your armor equipment, 2 ring slots, as well as a weapon and an offhand, although the offhand is kind of odd because it can be something obvious like a shield, but it's also sort of secondary weapon types like bows and things. And of course your main hand weapon slot can also include some two-handed weapons that take up both. You've also got 2 skill slots that will populate depending on the weapon that you're using. They seem to be tied to the weapon. Some weapons only have 1 skill on the right trigger, while others have 1 on the left trigger as well. And these can be all sorts of different things. They're usually just special attacks that are quite powerful but have a bit of a cooldown, and also cost some of that blue gauge up there at the top of the screen. As you would expect, stamina management is very important, and part of that is because your dodge roll, while being a useful immunity frame, having dodge roll is also really expensive in terms of your stamina gauge. So when you first start out, if you haven't upgraded your stamina yet, 1 dodge roll will be about half the gauge, and that'll basically leave you enough for like 2 attacks. So you've got to be really careful about how often you dodge. You also have an Estus-like healing system with those green flasks there. You start with 2 charges, but it's actually enhanced in kind of an unusual way. You have a skill tree in this game, and most of the skill tree nodes are just small enhancements to your health, stamina, and ether, the blue gauge. But there are also a couple of other things on the skill tree, like improvements to different weapon types that will make that weapon type a little bit more effective or cost less stamina or something like that. And you gain points to spend on this skill tree by finding these green shards throughout the areas, oftentimes hidden in difficult to reach places and stuff. And for every 5 of these shards you get, you will also get a new charge for your healing item. So you want to find these as often as possible because it's just nice to have the extra passive benefits that the skill tree gives you, but also in order to upgrade your healing flask. There is also a parrying system, which we'll get onto why that doesn't really work very well a little bit later, but yeah, you can parry by just holding up your shield right before an enemy attacks you, and it'll knock them off balance, although if it's a really mobile enemy, sometimes instead of stunning them in place, it'll sort of deflect them in an odd direction, which is a bit strange. Killing enemies gives you essence, and of course you do lose all of your essence where you die. You just have to make it back to where you died and pick it back up again to get it all back. You will find a couple of different kinds of checkpoints. There are these lamps that you light up with a green flame, and these big campfires that have a bigger green flame. The campfires you can actually spend your essence at to level yourself up. Just spend an increasing amount of essence every time to level up any given stat by 1. It's a pretty expected mechanic. It works exactly how you would think it would work, and there are stats for all your major things, strength for weapon damage, your sort of vitality for your maximum HP, all that good stuff. And you'll also find that all weapons in this game have some pretty significant stat requirements. Oftentimes a combination of strength and dexterity depending on the weapon type, although sometimes there's also focus, which is like the sort of magic stat. So if you're using, like fancy ranged weapons or sort of magic knight style of weapons, then you might find that as a requirement too. But you do have to meet these requirements, absolutely, because if you don't, then one swing of the weapon will be very ineffective and also take like all of your stamina, so you don't want to do that. You can fast travel in between any of the discovered campfires you found so far. The lamps are for sort of exploration's sake. Basically, whenever you go to a lamp, it'll replace the campfire as the spot that you'll respawn when you die, although respawning at a lamp does not respawn the enemies like using a campfire does. But you also can't use a lamp to level up or anything like that, so they're just checkpoints and that's it. You'll also find that there are a fair number of boss battles dotted around the place, and these tend to give you new movement capabilities to get you to new areas. You start out with a single jump and a dodge roll and the ability to grab onto walls and ceilings that have these like root growths on them, but you'll also get all your obvious stuff, like a double jump, for instance. And all the ways you'll be getting these involve killing bosses, so they are your sort of major milestones to find and defeat in order to unlock new areas. You'll also find that sometimes certain areas of the map have their own sort of traversal mechanics that you got to deal with, like your classic disappearing platforms or rolling stones or mushrooms you can hop around on and things like that. So far so standard. It is a pretty standard Metroidvania that is going for the whole Souls-like formula. It does pretty much everything it's supposed to do. It's got a nice art style and a solid soundtrack, and all of its presentation and everything is pretty well done. Here's the thing, though. I kind of hated my time with this game. I ended up just sort of giving up without getting too far because I simply wasn't having fun and was tired of running into dead ends and not knowing what to do. There are a large number of design decisions in this game that seem to exist purely to frustrate the player, and I found this game to be incredibly frustrating and often unenjoyable as a result. Just to start with, there's the fact that you only start with 2 healing charges, which in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem, but it becomes a problem when you combine it with the other aspects of this game's design, like the fact that the enemy density is way too high to be reasonable. So you will be slogging your way through dozens and dozens of enemies, and you only have 2 charges to go. And of course, all of the checkpoints are really, really far apart in this game. And so you will be basically just fighting through screen after screen of way too many enemies with very little healing for a really long time, and it makes the game feel like a complete slog. Basically, it feels like the fact that the lamps exist and act as checkpoints but don't respawn enemies is something that you have to abuse as much as possible just to get anywhere. Because if you don't, you will be slogging through so many enemies to get anywhere that it just becomes ridiculous. But if you let yourself die occasionally to replenish your very few healing charges and then have the enemies not respawn, then you can just sort of war of attrition your way through everything by just bashing your head against the wall until it finally decides to fall down. This is also a problem in the boss fights, by the way, which of course tend to have way too many enemy spawns in them and often take place around pits. Pretty much all the boss fights, it seems like, have some sort of pitfall idea so that you'll constantly be falling and taking huge amounts of damage while also fighting off way too many enemies. This really high enemy density thing is also the reason why the parry system doesn't work, because you will have a screen full of enemies all attacking you at slightly different times, which means you may be able to parry one of them, but during the animation you'll just get hit by all the others. So parrying is a way to get yourself killed rather than an actual rewarding mechanic. There are also a large number of incredibly annoying flying enemies that are much faster than you. You have quite a short range attack, so they very easily get out of your range and it can be very difficult to hit, but do an oddly large amount of damage when they hit you. However, you might think you're supposed to parry them to sort of stun them and actually get hits in on them, but that doesn't work. If you parry these guys, they just clip into the floor and you can't hit them there either, and then they'll start attacking you from areas off screen you couldn't see. This seems to be one of those Souls-likes that interprets the high difficulty of the genre as the game should just randomly kill the player all the time for no reason. You'll frequently come across areas that just kill you, and it doesn't seem like there was a way to prevent that from happening the first time. For instance, you may think that you're supposed to get to the end of this mushroom forest area, but if you actually do get to the end, then you instantly die from this green gas that you can barely see, because the areas are much too busy visually with a lot of stuff in the foreground that blocks out enemies and other hazards, so you will barely be able to see this little pocket of green gas that for some reason instant kills you, but it will instant kill you if you walk into it, and there's no warning that it's there and no explanation for how to get around it. It's just there. The very first treasure chest you're likely to come across is a mimic. You don't even know there are mimics in this game because it's the first chest you've ever seen, but if you dare to walk in front of it and press the open button because maybe you wanted to open the chest, for instance, then it will insta-kill you. There's no way to roll out of it or anything, it just kills you. The game also, in addition to having way too much stuff in the foreground that blocks your vision, also likes to put you in really dark places where you can't see anything that are, of course, as is everywhere else, filled with way too many enemies, so you will be taking damage from things you can barely see. There's even a room that has what I guess is supposed to be a trap on the floor, but you can't see any sort of pressure plates that you're pressing, and it seems to, I think, be firing darts, but you can't see the darts either because the room was almost pitch black, so you'll just be standing around taking sudden hits of damage from what looks like absolutely nothing and probably die. I had to die to that trap 3 times before I was even able to process the fact that it was probably a dart trap from the small context clue of being able to just barely see the edge of a dart sometimes when it got close enough to me that my light illuminated it. So that entire large room is just basically to frustrate the player. It's pitch black, full of enemies and traps, and you can't see anything that you're doing. This also extends to exploration, which is a big problem for me because, in my opinion, one of the biggest parts of a Metroidvania or a Souls-like, even if they're separate, is the exploration. You're supposed to have rewarding exploration, interesting places for the player to go, a lot of cool stuff for the player to find, for build variety's sake, and all that good stuff. This game didn't really get that memo, I don't think, and exploration is not only a slog because of the fact that there are way too many enemies everywhere and not enough checkpoints, but also frequently just runs you into dead ends and you have to backtrack through empty screen after screen of nothing just to get back on track. This also happens if you die to one of the random cheap things you never could have seen coming and have to go from your latest lamp all the way back to where you were. Since they're so far apart, you'll just be holding left for 10 minutes going through empty screens until you finally get back to where you were. So exploration is not enjoyable in this game. It actually feels very punishing because it constantly kills you at random and has no rewards really to give you. Occasionally you'll find a chest with some cool equipment or a new weapon or something, but only very occasionally. Most of the time you'll just run into dead ends, and this also happens when you're trying to figure out where in the world the game wants you to go, which it refuses to tell you. So you'll be constantly running into dead ends when you thought you finally made progress and finally found where it wants you to go, only to realize, 20 minutes later, after slogging through tons of enemies, that it's just yet another dead end and now you have no idea what to do. This eventually culminated in me fighting my way through a really long area with lots of really annoying platforming and stuff, only to finally get to the bottom, reach an elevator that seemed like progress, and then get put in a confusing room that made no sense and seems like a dead end. I couldn't move anywhere in the room. It was sort of dark and covering up my entire character with ruins in the foreground, so I couldn't even see where I was, but I also couldn't seem to navigate the room for reasons that I couldn't actually see. There was just sort of like an invisible wall, and since I thought that was the only way I could go, I was just sort of left feeling like, well, what do you even expect of me then, if this is the one place you finally let me go and it's just this confusing dead-end room that makes no sense. This is made worse by the fact that sometimes you can go in areas that look like dead ends but actually aren't, but it seems to not want you to sometimes. You'll rub your face against a wall that looks like it might be a door for 4 seconds and you can't go anywhere, but if you rub your face against it for 5 seconds, suddenly you'll be able to go somewhere, and there's a whole rest of the game behind that area that previously kind of seemed like you weren't actually supposed to go there. So basically what I would have to do is just go back through the world to all of those dead ends I found and rub my face against all the walls for like 10 seconds, just in case one of them was actually progress. It just didn't look like progress at first because it refused to let me transition to a new screen. When there actually was a new screen, it was just being shy. And that's when I decided I'd had enough. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to backtrack through all these areas, rubbing my face on all the places that may or may not be doors until the game decides it wants to actually show me. And I just wasn't having enough fun to make that worthwhile, so I decided to give up and I stopped. And for me, the worst thing is I don't even think that this is a bad game. I think it has some really good ideas. I love its visuals. I think its music is great. I just think that a lot of the design is so incredibly frustrating that it just doesn't gel with me and I can't get on with it. So even though I personally can't recommend it, if it still does look interesting to you, then you may actually want to check it out. So I'll put the link in the description below this video as always, just so that you can go and do so if you wish. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.